everyone. Welcome to Evidence-Based Inclusive Practices. We are presenting through our SELPA, which is our Sonoma County SELPA, which is a special education local plan area. And I just want to introduce ourselves. So, my name is Susan Langer, there on the left, and I am a program specialist for the Sonoma County SELPA and Charter SELPA. I started out in general education, then became a school psychologist, special education administrator, and now I'm here with the SELPA. And my area of expertise here in the SELPA is inclusive practices and mostly preschool. Also, working with the mod severe population and ELLs with disabilities. And then my colleague Suzanne Tribby may want to introduce herself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Suzanne Tribby, and my training is also as a school psychologist. And I've been practicing in special education for almost 20 years now. And yeah, most of the bulk of my experience was with preschool, but I have spent a lot of time in the age group between 2.5 all the way up to 22. So we have done a lot of work in this area of inclusive practices here in our SELPA, and we're excited to share some of these practices with you.
So, when you're talking about inclusive practices, you really want to think of um, how we're really improving child outcomes. And to improve child outcomes, not just academically, but social emotional outcomes as well, you really want to look at, if you're looking at the outside of this hexagon, you want to really look at all those areas which really do affect the outcomes for a preschool child. And so there's family engagement, there's the pyramid model, embedded instruction practices, desired results developmental profile, the DRDP, and the preschool foundations and supporting inclusive practices. All of those have really been shown to be quite effective in improving child outcomes. And today we're really going to focus on pyramid model, embedded instruction teaching practices, and inclusive practices, specifically universal design for learning. So, what really makes an inclusive program successful? We know that using evidence-based practices is extremely important. Um, we could try all sorts of different curriculums and frameworks, but knowing that it's evidence-based really gives us that comfort, really, of knowing that this has been tried and true. We are not wasting our time. We're not providing instruction that's not going to be helpful for that child. So really evidence-based practices is extremely important when designing an inclusive program. Adapting activities so that each child can participate. Again, inclusive doesn't mean that child's in the class. They are actively participating in what their peers are participating in. Making reasonable modifications to policies, practices, and procedures. You know, sometimes thinking about what are your policies in the district, in the school. I worked in a district where the policies were you could just have a certain amount of special ed kids in a general ed classroom. Or the teacher was able to say, sorry, I reached my limit. So thinking about those policies, are those inclusive practices in the district? Embed children's developmental goals in daily routines. We know that by teaching a child while they're in the routine helps them generalize that skill, and it's more engaging to the child as opposed to being pulled out. Also, welcoming all children. All our children are children first, general education first. They're not special education first. Okay. What are the benefits of inclusion? Like I just said, seen as a child is first. The special needs, that's secondary. They are a child. Um, just like any of the other kids in the class, they want to have fun, they want to make friends, right? They we want to make sure they have a positive self-concept, learning appropriate social skills just like their peers, learning to cope and problem solve, and becoming more independent and self-reliant. Sometimes we forget our kids are going to be adults someday. So what is our focus? Why do we want them to be um, getting this education? It's really so that they can be independent, self reliant adults. Observe, imitate, and learn from the other children. Susie Tribby, my colleague, always says, our kid, and it's so true, our kids, as much as we want to think that us as teachers are really the most important person in that child's life, it's really their friends and their peers. And that's where they learn from. And so, in order to learn a skill, the best place to learn a skill is with their peers. And we want them to learn to accept and become comfortable with individual differences. So yes, our students can be included, but all the students benefit by inclusion. We want our world to be an inclusive place for all of us to live. We're all different. We're all different learners. We come from different cultures. And the more that we can learn to live together and appreciate diversity, that better our world will be for all our kids. Increase their self esteem through helping others, recognizing strengths and abilities in children who are different, right? And we're all different. We just may have more areas of need than others. Explore new ways of being a friend and decrease fears and prejudices and gain new awareness of ability to express caring, concern, and compassion. I'm not going to focus too long on this, but just so you know the history of special education and specifically least restrictive environment. Around 1975, we had the PL 94-192 legislation passed, and that was really to provide that students had the right to provide to have free and appropriate public education in what's called the least restrictive environment. Notice that they don't say inclusion, right? But they do say least restrictive environment. And also around 1990, 97, IDA included the requirement that students may need to have those extra services so that they can access their general education. And then around 2004, we know that now the IDA is requiring that we really make sure that our students with disabilities are integrated with the non-disabled peers. And again, that's the least restrictive environment. Okay, and this is just a little bit more information on that. I'm not going to get into the details. Okay. I really love this visual because so many folks think that really inclusion is just putting a child in a classroom with their gen ed peers. And I've had that as well. I mean, I've done that. I said, oh, I'll just take this child, put him in a class, give him an aid, and everything will be hunky dory. Well, it wasn't. And what I realized that was really almost inclusion or segregation, I mean, my student was kind of in the back. She had her own little curriculum going on, instruction, and she wasn't really integrated. And what I learned is that in order to be inclusive, we had to really teach the staff and the children how to work together and how to embed what that child was learning in the class within the activities that were occurring in the class. And then we started to see that inclusion happening. But also, inclusion can lead to teaching diversity and learning how other people learn, maybe different cultural aspects to how someone might learn, really even just opens the door to more inclusive practices. Okay, so we talked about this model, and so the first inclusive based practice that we're going to talk about is called the pyramid model. And you can get information on the pyramid model through West Ed does a California version of the pyramid model, and it's a great training. And I've been through it, and I can't stress enough what a great training that is. And then you can also get information on the pyramid model through the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. And there's a lot of great modules you can go through and be trained through them. And really the pyramid model is a model that teaches social emotional learning and skills, because we know that skills, you're not born with social emotional skills. We all need to learn those skills just like we would learn to learn to read. Here we go. Here is the pyramid model. And it's really, if you know what MTSS is, or you've learned about RTI, you know about the tiers. So on the bottom is really the tier one, where it's for everybody. It's universal promotion for all, which means that what we implement affects all the students in there and they can all benefit from it, correct? And whether special ed, general ed, everybody benefits. And the first tier, you've got the effective workforce, nurturing responsive relationships, and high quality supportive environments. Those are really the base of the pyramid. And without that base, you really can't focus on maybe more the areas in need. You really need this healthy base in order to be able to focus maybe on areas that might need a little more intensive work. Then the second area, which is the secondary prevention, is so you've got this base in on the bottom here, and it's really been strong and emphasized, but you've got some kiddos that might need a little extra emotional supports. And so that's the area where you might just focus on a smaller group and some more targeted social emotional teaching. And it could be one child or a small group. And again, it doesn't have to be kids with an IEP or special education. It could just be those kids who, might just need that little extra help. So now you've done the effective workforce, the environments, you've worked on the relationships, you've did those targeted social emotional supports, and we still may have a child who needs more intensive support, and that would be the very top. And as you can see, that should only be a couple of kids in the class. It shouldn't be 50% of the kids. If you have all those other things in place, then maybe that's when you may focus on a child who might need some extra supports like an IEP or special education. Okay. And here we go. And so when you're teaching pyramid and when you're working with teams, and it really is a year process with coaching, with a leadership group, when you really have all of that in place, then this is how you go through it. So you may spend the first couple of trainings just looking at making sure that the workforce, they understand how to develop relationships, they understand their own maybe biases coming into a class and how that affects other students, or if how they approach their job. And then you also look at the nurturing and responsive relationships and the high quality supportive environments. And so those might be those 2 full days of training right there. And then we have another day of training where we look at more targeted social emotional supports. And then maybe the final day of training, you're going to look at intensive individualized interventions, and they talk about positive support and how to create a positive support plan. Okay. So really, when you're looking at the first part and you're looking at an effective workforce, it's really important to know your own behavior and attitudes and how that affects the children, right? So for instance, you want to maybe know what pushes your buttons, and I can tell you what pushes my buttons, and that can be, and I can see Susie Tribby is kind of grinning a little bit, But boy, a child who gets on the floor and starts screaming, oh, that hurts my ears. That hurts my ears. And I kind of get flushed and I kind of just get in that fight and flight mode when I hear that screaming. And so I know that that kind of pushes my buttons. Or if a child talks back, I was brought up not to talk back to my parents. So it still kind of triggers me a little bit. So I have to kind of think about, okay, how does that impact my relationship with that child and their family? And maybe I can reframe that a little bit about, oh, that child really is crying out and needs some help. How can I work with that communication with adults? And just by reframing and thinking about that can really change your attitude with working with that child. Yeah, and this is just a fun way that we look at just building the pyramid. And again, it is called building the pyramid because you want to first have this very stable base, and that's building positive relationships with your students. And once you have that positive relationship, you're developing supportive environments, making sure the classroom environment is engaging and exciting and yet has the expectations so that we don't have a lot of behaviors around those areas in the classroom, and then really getting into teaching more specific social skills to students that maybe aren't learning those things at home. And then, of course, the individualized interventions. But if you have that strong base, you're not going to have a lot going on in the top. We're going to have kids learning how to work with others in the classroom. Okay, so again, this is the pyramid, universal promotion for all. We talked about just that having that effective workforce, developing those relationships with your students, and getting to know them, um, checking in with different kids, making sure you know about their family, and maybe having pictures of their family on the wall, um, knowing about some of their fun activities after school, right? Knowing about their cultures, maybe bringing that into the classroom. So they really is that develop of that trust. And once that child trusts you, they will be able to work on areas of need because they trust what you're saying is tried and true. And then having those supportive environments, making sure that classroom is engaging and well established through the class. So making sure that things are spread out a little bit. We don't have this one popular area and none of the other areas are of interest. So you got this a lot of kids fighting over just a few things. So really looking at the environments, making sure you have visuals, right? So just making sure that the visuals of how to use the different areas in the class. You've got your schedule, you're checking the schedule, you're reviewing it with the kids, you've got the classroom expectations, you're reviewing that with the kids, and that becomes a very supportive environment. And then we got the relationships, making sure that we're um, we're not just making having a relationship with the children, but the families, right? And actually even the team members in the classroom. So kids the kids in the class are going to watch how you interact with your colleagues. And so if you're not communicating well, then the children are not going to feel as supported and safe in that environment. And then what we talked about, the high quality environments, making sure that they're inclusive environments, making sure that we've got a comprehensive system of curriculum, evidence based curriculum, that we're assessing the students, that they're making progress, and assessing the program as well, making sure we have something where we can look at, do we have everything in order? Are we using the schedule in a way that is helpful for the students? And then we're now talking about targeted social emotional supports. And then, yes. And so again, maybe teaching a little bit about self-regulation. Maybe some kids need a little extra we should teach all the kids about self-regulation, right? But a little extra for those kids that really need to practice how to use it, how to ask for it, maybe independently doing it without having to be told that they need it. So really explicit instruction for those kind of things. How do you, maybe using a timer? They need a timer to transition from activity to activity. So those things, they might just need a little extra help, and making sure we're taking data to make sure that what we're doing is working. Okay. And what we said is the intensive interventions are really just should be a few kids. If we have everything in place, this should not be a whole classroom, right? It should be one or two kids in the class. And what we're doing here is really making sure that we are connecting with the family, that they feel supported, that we have a team that can do some standardized assessments, observations. We're working with the different team members, and really making sure that we can come up with a plan to support that child. And then just leaving you with a lovely quote here is that young children's close relationships with preschool teachers and caregivers are also important to their development of school readiness. A number of studies have found that the warmth and security of the preschool child's relationship with a preschool teacher are predictive of the child's subsequent classroom performance, attentional skills, and social competence in the kindergarten and primary grade classroom.
All right. So again, I'm Susie Tribby, Program Specialist with the SELPA, and I'm going to be talking a bit about the Embedded Instruction Program. I've been an Embedded Instruction coach for 5 years now. And so I have learned with other teachers about the Embedded Instruction Program throughout this time, and it is a highly effective, wonderful process. But this is just an introduction. To become a teacher who wants to do embedded instruction is you're basically committing to some pretty intense days of instruction, right? You're going to be going through a multiple days worth of training, and then on top of that, some coaching. So just keep in mind, this is a very brief overview of all the different practices within embedded instruction. Here's the definition of embedded instruction. It's a multi-component approach to provide intentional and systematic instruction on priority learning targets during typically occurring activities, routines, and transitions to support child engagement and learning. And you're going to see how each of these practices touch on that definition. The embedded instruction program has its own website, and when you become an embedded instruction teacher or coach, they give you access to a website that has so many materials and wonderful resources and videos for you to really hone in on your practice. These are the 4 practices within embedded instruction. What to teach, which focuses on learning targets. When to teach, which is focusing on activities and routines. How to teach, which looks at complete learning trials. And then, of course, how to evaluate, which monitors child progress, in addition to other components where keeping data becomes quite valuable. So let's dive into what to teach. So Susan had mentioned the California Preschool Learning Foundations earlier. Those become really important when you're thinking about embedded instruction, when you just start embedded instruction, because when we are talking about that first practice, what to teach, it's really vital to take a look at what are students learning, and maybe take a look at their DRDP results to see where the student is functioning, and then look at what is the next step for that student, what is the next skill for them. Students that have IEPs or individualized education programs that come into a general ed preschool, it's important to take a look at their goals that are written to maybe really target specific areas that they're working on. So you take those 3 sources of information, the DRDP, the preschool foundations, and the student's IEP, and you try to come up with some learning target skills that a student can achieve in 3 to 4 weeks. So here we have a student with an IEP goal participating in play to build positive relationships with peers. And on the DRDP, the student is having relationships and social interactions with peers, and they're becoming increasingly competent and cooperative in these interactions with peers, and is starting to develop friendships with several peers. So how do we break that skill down into a target skill? And so we call those priority learning targets. It's just something that's small, that's achievable, that's within the child's proximal development, right? It's just right there. It's just enough to challenge them. And so we have 3 examples of target skills at the top of your screen. We have one target skill that's focused on giving objects to peers when verbally requesting. We have another target skill that says requesting a turn or an object using 1 to 2 words, such as my turn or want truck. And then we have initiating by asking peers to play using 1 to 2 words. I play, play, or we play. So as you can see here, if you're thinking about it, really where you would want to start with a student, especially if they don't yet quite have any verbal skills, is you would want to start with the student just giving objects to peers when verbally requested. And so we were able to come up with that target skill by looking at the student's IEP and also other areas such as the DRDP and the preschool learning foundations. Here's another example of how we can break down an IEP goal into smaller parts. If the IEP goal is something like spontaneously using 3 words to request, describe, or label objects and express agent, action, object relations, when a preschool team first sees a goal like that, it seems overwhelming and it might be a little bit confusing. And it's also hard to picture how might that look in day-to-day interactions. And so here at the top are examples of how using embedded instruction practices can help you break that down, that IEP goal down into more understandable, measurable day-to-day skills. So first we have using 1 word to request an object, such as a ball or a cookie. Then we have, as the student maybe gains more skills or 3 to 4 weeks later, we could work on having the student use 2 words to request an object, want ball or more cookie. And then as the student keeps gaining more and more skills, we push them up to the next level, which is using 3 words to request an object, such as I want ball or want more cookie. So you can see it's looking at where the student is, thinking about the next step where we expect them to be, and then using targeted, intentional learning opportunities so that they can learn those skills and build from them. Here's an example of all the components in a priority learning target. First, we have the learner, which is the student. And then we have the behavior. And the thing to keep in mind about behavior is that it needs to be something that is observable and measurable. So for example, I've worked with some teachers that were trying to write priority learning targets about a student sitting in circle time. And so that behavior becomes a little bit difficult to observe and to measure, right? Because, well, I mean, the one thing that you can measure is, I guess, how long they're sitting in circle time, but you want to make sure that it's a lot better when you're writing targets, priority learning targets, to focus on behaviors that you can see and measure that it passes the stranger test. Anybody who's asking, who sees that student, if they're just a stranger walking in off the street, they can say, oh, that kid is doing that behavior. And so when you're asking a student to just sit at circle time, that's a little bit more ambiguous, right? And so then you would want to maybe change the behavior to maybe the student is singing along with songs, or the student then takes their name and puts it up on the board if they're present. So something like that is, the idea is we want the students to be participating in circle. And so when a student grabs their name and puts it on the board, that's more observable and measurable than a student just sitting during circle. Because if a potato can do it, then it's not really a good description of a behavior. And then we have the conditions. So is it after a peer model or is it after an adult model? Like, what are the conditions of the student meeting this target? Then we have activities. We want to specify during what activities will the student be practicing this skill? And of course, the criterion is basically how we know that the student has mastered this skill. So let's dive into that a little bit with a little bit more detail using a real example. Here we have Mia. She's our learner. We'll name colors of objects, red, blue, green, and yellow. So that is the specific behavior. So it's very, very clear. If she is naming a color, that's really easy for any stranger off the street to be able to say, oh, she did that behavior, and they'd be able to count it. When asked by an adult or peer, so we know that we're the adults in the room or the peers are going to have to set the occasion up to say things like, Mia, what color is that? So you know that that question will be asked of her throughout her day, or actually specifically during a variety of classroom activities, as it states here in the orange. And then the criterion, how we know that she's mastered this skill, is she's identifying each color correctly twice a day for 3 consecutive days. So she'll have lots of opportunities for practice. Here are more examples of priority learning targets that have been written that follow that same exact equation, right? Where you have the learner, the behavior, and then you have the conditions, the activities, and the criterion at the end. So it can cover really a lot of different areas that students are working on throughout their day and goals. Next, let's go into when to teach. So when you're looking at those target skills, you want to think about, okay, what would be an appropriate time to work on those priority learning targets? So you want to make sure it's a good fit. So having a student working on 2-word requests is a natural fit for when you're thinking about snack time, right? Because if somebody has the access to the food and you're wanting that student to practice using 2-word requests, what's a more motivating activity than a snack, right? So that would be a really, really natural fit to work on those 2-word requests for that student. Then we also have what's called a logical fit. And so for this particular student, if we're having them name colors, a logical fit would be to do that during snack, especially if you're serving students and they have different colored placemats or different colored bowls or cups, or perhaps they have different color lunch boxes or the different colors of packaging that their food comes in. These are all really wonderful opportunities where color will be around and can be discussed during snack time. So it makes sense. That would be a logical fit to work on naming colors during snack time. But what might not be a good fit would be pointing to objects in books during snack. So you wouldn't necessarily think about working on pointing to objects in a book when the activity is snack time, because we don't typically have books out during snack time, or at least I hope you don't, because that's, they'll get dirty that way. So, so that would not be a good fit. So you come up with these learning targets and you think about the schedule of the day and you think, okay, where do I fit these learning targets in? That would be a natural or logical fit for that particular student. Here's an example of an activity matrix for 3 students. So you can see all the different priority learning targets that they've identified. And then they on the left-hand side, on the left column, you see all the different times of day and the activities during the day. And so what this staff did is they said, okay, so when would be a good time to work on using 2 to 3 words to initiate play? And so for Devon, that would be during circle time, or centers rather. Another good time to practice skills is also during centers when you're trying to count objects. So when you think about you're sitting at a table with a group of kids and they're playing with different materials, it seems like it would be logical then to have a skill where you're counting objects during that time. So it's plugging in these learning targets during the day that you know that they're going to have, there's going to be a logical or natural fit to work on these skills, and making sure that there's enough learning opportunities for the student to be able to master the skill. Here is a real life example of an activity matrix that was posted in one of our classrooms up here in Sonoma County. And so you can see here that they had a nice laminated chart. It was nice and big. Everybody could see it. Any staff that was working in this classroom could reference it. And so if I were a staff in the classroom and I'm looking over at the activity matrix, I know that for student number 2, I'm going to be working on at least 2 learning targets during that time, because I see 2 different colored Post-its, right? And then during free play for students 2 and 3, I see a red post-it, I see a pink post-it, and I see a yellow post-it. So I'm going to make sure that I go over, I read those post-its, and I think to myself, this is what I'm going to be this is what I'm going to be providing learning opportunities for those students. So it's a real quick and easy way for staff to just quickly see what they need to do next. Next, we're going to talk about how to teach, which is complete learning trials. And for a complete learning trial, you need an antecedent, behavior, and consequence. The antecedent is typically provided by the adult in the room or set up in the environment. The behavior is what we want the student to be doing, which is the priority learning target behavior, which we've already discussed. And then the consequence is making sure we follow up with saying, yay, yeah, that's right, you did it. Or yes, that color is red. Some sort of consequence that will ensure that this behavior will happen again, and it'll help the student learn that what they did was the right thing to do. So you could see there's a chain of behavior. And if you were to take the training with embedded instruction, they talk about all the different scenarios that what if the behavior doesn't happen? What if the teacher sets up the environment for the behavior to occur, but it doesn't happen? Or what makes for a strong consequence? Here's an example of a complete learning trial. While Matthew is playing with a truck, his teacher joins the game and asks, "What color is it?" as she points to the truck. Matthew looks at the truck and says, "Yellow." And the teacher responds, "Yes, that is a yellow truck." So here we have all those chains. None of those chains are broken, and we have a complete learning trial. When we have complete learning trials, we know that the behaviors are more likely to occur again. And so it really, really helps to provide those sufficient opportunities for learning, especially if we're only planning on working on those skills 3 to 4 weeks at a time. Now, here's an example of an incomplete learning trial where the teacher prompts Matthew to say, "Cookie, please," to request a cookie during snack. Matthew says, "Cookie, please." He does the behavior, but the teacher is leaving the table and does not hear him. So then there was no consequence. So the likelihood of Matthew learning that skill might take a little bit longer if he doesn't get that sort of feedback, knowing that the behavior that he did was correct. And finally, let's talk really quickly about how to evaluate. And of course, this is the more challenging practice of all the embedded instruction practices, because it really does take a look at adult behavior and figuring out, well, am I doing it? Am I providing enough learning opportunities? Are these learning opportunities working? And so it's looking at the student data to see if they're making progress. And then finally answering the question, do I need to make changes? So first, here's an example of how a teacher has collected data. Am I doing it data? And so they're looking at how many priority learning targets they had planned for these 2 learning targets. So using 2 to 3 words to initiate play and counting up to 3 objects. So this teacher had planned to provide 6 opportunities, learning opportunities throughout the day for those priority learning targets. Well, we find out that she only implemented 2 out of the 6 for using 2 to 3 words to initiate play, but she did implement all 6 of the planned priority learning targets or opportunities throughout the day. And so here we have a difference of 4, 0, with a total of 4 here. And so that gives us some information, and we chart it down here. The blue represents the planned and the green represents the implemented. And you could see that the student, even though we have planned for plenty of learning opportunities, that the teaching staff is not providing those learning targets or opportunities enough for the student to make progress. So at this point, that would be really informative of the team so that they can say to themselves, okay, well, what isn't working? How come we're not providing enough of those implemented opportunities throughout our day? Maybe there's an illogical fit. Maybe there's a bad fit between the time of day and the learning skill that we're asking for the student. So is it working? Here's an example of some is it working data where we have the student, we're looking at how much prompting is required for this particular student. So we have right here, we have performance up here that says independent, following model, or following a physical prompt. So here we see that the student has actually, the light blue is showing that the student is doing a lot of these behaviors quite independently, and just, a little bit of following a model, and sometimes with physical prompting. So this student is, this is a nice way to take a look at how much support the student is needed, or how much support is needed for the student in order for them to engage in that behavior. So if the child has reached the criterion, then it makes sense to move on to the next skill, or whatever the next more difficult skill would be for that particular student. Is the student making progress? Great, continue what you've been doing. But if the student is not making progress, then something needs to change, right? You need to change how or what you are teaching. So maybe the skill is too difficult for that particular student, or maybe they need a little bit more support. Maybe they need a peer support, or they need an adult model in order to engage in that behavior. Here are just some other examples of how we collect data using the embedded instruction program. And it really does make sense to work with the teacher and figure out, okay, so what kind of data would you want to look at? What's most informative at this time in order to make some decisions about the student's learning? Okay, Susan, I think this is for you now.
Okay, so we talked about inclusive practices, evidence-based. We talked about pyramid, which is an evidence-based practice. It takes out some training, some time, some coaching. We talked about embedded instruction, again, evidence-based practice, takes time for training, coaching, but we know with all that training and coaching provides real evidence-based or real evidence that it's working. And so now we're going to talk about another evidence-based framework, which we call UDL, Universal Design of Learning. And on the bottom here is where you can get a load of information on UDL guidelines. You can get teaching plans. It's just all the information you would ever need is right in this website, cast.org. Okay, here's some examples of some UDL, Universal Design for Learning. Really, it's really looking at that environment and how do we make that environment for accessible, not just for folks who may have mobility issues or learning issues, but for everybody. And we can see here, like this push to open, right? It was designed for someone in a wheelchair who could not navigate maybe pulling the door open and going in. But boy, when I had my two kids with me and I was holding one in one arm and the other hand, boy, that was a great thing for me to have, to be also to hit it and to be able to go in. And so it was accessible not just for me, but for everybody. I also love that push to open during COVID when I didn't want to touch anything. I just put my elbow on there and the door would open. So these are just examples of how that environment is actually supporting folks with different accessibility issues that may be permanent or just temporary. And so when you're looking inside a classroom, we also want to be able to set up a classroom the same way. And the reason is no two brains are alike. And what that means is we don't have two people who are the same exact learners. We all learn differently. And so what we know is that variability is the dominant feature of the nervous system, which means that we're all different. And what it means is that we need to think about that when we're setting up a classroom. And so the three main specific ways that we really want to make sure that we are providing an accessible classroom is we want to make sure that the kids are engaged. And so that's part of accessibility. You know, we tend to think of flexible seating, or visuals, which are very important. But engagement, really making sure that we're recruiting that interest is so important for accessibility to the curriculum for all students. We also want to make sure that we're doing representation, making sure that what we're teaching is actually accessible visually for the student. And then also another area of making sure that the classroom is accessible is action and expression. And we're going to get into all three. And so first we're going to look at engagement. So how do we get the student engaged in the activity? Let's say we're talking about, um, you know, uh, trucks, right? So they could spell truck, they could draw the truck. If we're counting how many wheels on the truck. So we really want to tap into their interest, make sure that we offer that support. And so also offering challenges, because we know one thing is students lose in interest when they think something's too hard or they're going to fail. So we want to make sure they push through that.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about representation. So Susan just mentioned engagement, and now we're going to go into representation, which is the what of learning. And so you can see from this chart here that there's all sorts of different ways that students can access, build, or internalize with representation. So what does that look like? That means presenting information in a bunch of different ways. So for example, this is a teacher. I'm not exactly sure what she's teaching. She could be teaching the, well, it looks like she's bringing her hands together. So it looks like she's possibly signing for more, but she could, who knows what she's teaching? She could be teaching about recycling and how recycling can help the environment. Because I see in the background, there's all these different posters on recycling. And so maybe she's having the students act out um, what's the process of going from producing something to using it to then recycling it, and having them dance instead of just talking about it. So we know that the more movement that students have access to, the more likely they are to be engaged and to learn, and also gives them a nice way to be able to express what they've learned. Here we have a book that, rather than just talking passively or reading a book to the students, here we have a teacher that uses Velcro and icons to demonstrate taking that really more abstract concept of counting, especially if you're a preschooler, like what do all these numbers mean, and making it a little bit more concrete. And so having the students actually be able to pull off those icons and use the Velcro to put them onto the little chicks to represent how many little chicks are there on that page. Here we have, rather than just talking about what we throw away, we have a teacher that has drawn using graphics. We have the teacher also using words in case we have those students that can read. And I love how they bring in those descriptive words so that the students are building their vocabulary. And so you're building that interest by providing all of these ways that a student can access, because sometimes not all students are able to read the words or even understand when a teacher is saying words. And so by drawing out objects, you're more likely to get the understanding. The student is going to all students are more likely to be able to understand what the teacher is talking about. Here we have, we're not just talking about pairs, but here we have a teacher that has actually provided pairs in the classroom in a jar. So then that way we're taking something that might be abstract and, we're saying the word pair, but actually showing this is a pair, and then providing different opportunities to talk about it and discuss it. And so again, we're building that engagement, but also through representation in what the students see and what they're talking about in that moment. And lastly, we're talking about action and expression. How do students express what they've learned, right? And so if we're expecting all students to just basically talk back to us to express how they've learned something, then we might not be reaching all of the students, right? And so giving students an opportunity to be able to express what they've learned in a bunch of different ways. So here we have a student that has learned that when you mix certain colors together, it makes purple. So when you mix together maybe blue and pink, you're more likely to get purple. She not only demonstrated that on a piece of paper, but also in the trays. And then she demonstrated that by putting it on her hands and on her face, right? And so a bunch of different ways that this student can express how she's learned that combining these colors, these primary colors can make a new color. And that's just a fun, exciting way that we can build in these universal design for learning supports. Here we have students that had maybe perhaps read a book where there was a castle or a boat. And so then what we had the students do is demonstrate that what is a castle, right? And so rather than just saying what a castle is, they looked through the classroom materials and found some materials and they made their own castles or they made their own boats. So again, providing multiple means of action expression for all students so that they can participate. You can also do this with Play-Doh. We've also had students that were able to do some role play rather than just regurgitating what they've heard in the classroom.
So here we have a cartoon, and I'll go through it. It just says our teacher has an interesting theory. She says teaching is like bowling. All you can do is roll the ball down the middle and hope you touch most of the students. And Charlie Brown, who we know is very intelligent, says she must be a terrible bowler because what we know from bowling is that if you push the ball down the middle, you'll get the middle pins, but you won't get those outside pins. And those outside pins really are our students. So if we're just focusing our class for those average middle of the road class students, we're going to lose so many of our students who may be different learners. And so this is just a great example of that. And then this is our inclusion conference Padlet. So we're going to be adding information, the slides on here, and just some extra resources that you can use to help you implement inclusive practices in your classroom. And if you need to contact either one of us to talk more about how to provide training on UDL or Pyramid or embedded instruction, you're welcome to email us or call myself, Susan Langer, or Suzanne Tribby.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we'd love to hear if you're going to embark on maybe taking some of these programs and using them at your own school site. So take care, everybody, and keep on including. Thank you.